We've been talked about, sure you born, but we'll never turn back. No, we'll never turn back until we've all been free and we have equality. We have hung our heads and cried for all those like Lee who died for you and died for me, died for the cause of equality, but we'll never turn back. No, we'll never turn back until we've all been free and we have equality. And we have equality.
True justice. True justice. Documentaries like this move us to act, move us to know more in order to do more. Stevenson's first words in the film were a reflection upon the constitution of this country, saying he is constantly reminded of those constitutional words in order to make sense of what he does. As we see, he has dedicated his entire career to making those ideals real. I recall hearing Bryan Stevenson give a keynote address at a conference of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History a couple of years ago. His words tell a painful but truthful story that we all need to hear and heed, and that's why this documentary is so deeply important. Some of you may have seen the big screen story about Bryan Stevenson called Just Mercy, based on his book of the same title. But this film that we've seen tonight brings to the surface the deep sense of history in which Stevenson roots his work. He takes us back and brings us forward, very much like the African Sankofa bird. Stevenson shows us the roots of the brokenness of our country's systems and reminds us that we are all a part of it and we all have a role to play in bringing justice into being. He tells the story of slavery, of Reconstruction, of convict leasing, of criminalization, of Jim Crow, and of the new Jim Crow. And it's powerful that the film ends with a look at the Legacy Museum and Memorial that tells the story, because that's what museums do. We tell the story. We are so grateful that we have tonight with us legal experts and scholars who will engage with us on topics that were brought up in the film. And it's my delight to introduce to you those panelists tonight. Our moderator is James F. Johnson. He is an associate attorney with the Emory Ready PLC, and he litigates workers' compensation, personal injury, and third-party matters throughout Washington state. Prior to joining Emory Ready in 2016, he spent several years as a King County prosecutor, where he appeared in court daily, taking numerous felony and misdemeanor trials to verdict. For the past several years, Mr. Johnson has served on the executive board of the Loren Miller Bar Association, which is our local African-American bar association, and he is currently serving as its president. Our first panelist tonight is Tonie Davis. Ms. Davis is a staff attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union. And our other panelist tonight is Dr. Alexis Harris. She is the presidential term professor and professor of sociology at the University of Washington. Her book, entitled A Pound of Flesh: Monetary Sanctions as a Punishment for the Poor, details the ways in which sentenced fines and fees often put an undue burden on disadvantaged populations and place them under even greater supervision of the criminal justice system. We thank our moderator and our panelists for their time and their insights tonight. Let us now hear from them. James.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending tonight, and for all those that played a hand into just making this possible. I think what we just watched was an amazing movie, and I hope to have some great dialogue for everyone to enjoy and then ask questions towards the end. Just to open this up, I'm going to start with you, Ms. Davis. In what ways have you learned, either from the film or life experience, that our history of racial injustice is not told, changed, or masked? And with that, why does truth-telling matter?
That's a big question, and good evening, everyone. And thanks for the question, James. I'll start why truth-telling matters. And it matters because you can't get to reconciliation without reaching a common understanding of what the truth is. Now, there's been a lot of erasure in the history of African Americans within our country, as well as other people of color. A failure to acknowledge accomplishments, even going as far as to create narratives around white superiority in accomplishments that don't exist. If we can't bridge that superior attempt, the fabrication of superiority in order to dwarf those who, people of color, those who have brought much structure to our country, whose backs this country was built upon, the many accomplishments that people of color have made and contributed to this country, then everything that we know as the foundation of this country it's not steady. It doesn't even exist, right? It's a fallacy. So until we actually are able to bridge and have those honest conversations and do some truth telling, and not just about the good or the bad, but just about facts, what has been, we'll never be able to reach a point of reconciliation and to move forward as a country. There will always be tribalism. There will be a sense of us versus them, as opposed to all of us.
Thank you. Professor Harris, do you have anything to say on that?
Sure. So, I teach at the University of Washington, social problems class, and a class on race relations in the United States. And I found that it's not even just our freshmen, but our sophomores, our juniors don't know the history. So I learned to develop the class on race relations in the United States to really begin with the history that Mr. Stevenson outlined, to talk about the genocide of Native Americans and what colonization is, to talk about enslavement of peoples from Africa, to talk about the internment of Asian Americans, Japanese Americans here in our own, backyard, to talk about the changing borders with Mexico, that this isn't anything new that we're seeing today, that there's this constant struggle for, and all of this is really, I think bringing in that history and giving that context allows people to understand the broader narrative of systemic racism and to see the patterns throughout history, that this isn't new. And this just didn't happen, right? But that we've had constant iterations of social control of particularly Black people in this country, but other people who have been racially marginalized or through economics. So, exactly what Mr. Stevenson was saying, through enslavement to, convict leasing, to, slave leasing, convict leasing, Black codes, Jim Crow, mass conviction and incarceration, monetary sanctions, what I study, there's always been some legalized form of enslavement that extracts the labor either on the day in the field or future labor from monetary sanctions, fines and fees with interest and payment penalties, right? So if we have that history, we can have a broader understanding of the systemic problems that are sort of woven into the cracks and crevices of our institutions. So.
Yeah, thank you both for that. And, my perspective on it is, what we're really looking at is a big power play that derives from a lack of education, in a sense. And one thing that we have now is the benefit of hindsight, right? Typically, when you're going into a situation, you don't have that. But if you're able to look back on what was wrong before, and it's still happening now, the question I would pose to anyone is, well, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to sit there and do nothing? And what I was told and kind of raised with as a child is, if you're not part of the solution, then you're part of the problem. So that's just something, I try to take with myself and not impose, but suggest to others, just for a frame of thought reference. What can you do? Not saying that you have to have all the answers, but there's something that you can do to kind of help keep moving the ball forward. And I think it gets hard, but what do you do to try to help? And I'm posing this to both of you. What do you try to do to integrate the difficult truths into our national false narratives to try to address, these problems and help foster change?
I'll go first. I think some of it, we have to recognize that people there's a continuum of understanding, and we have to recognize where people are. And I do that in my teaching, but I also am at a certain point where I'm like, look, y'all, we know that there's systemic racism. We know there's state-sponsored violence. We see it, at a certain point, we need to say all of us are complicit in this system unless we're actively doing something. I was on a panel a few years ago at a law school conference. It was at Yale, and I was very nervous. And there were two state Supreme Court justices that spoke before me. It was about monetary sanctions, and they were sort of, patted themselves on their backs and they're doing great changes. And then I got up there and I said, well, actually, no, we still have huge problems. And it was very uncomfortable. I was also the only person of color on the panel. And right after me, the governor got up, and I just so appreciate it. You never know where your allies are going to be, because he said, you know what, we just had a lesson on the empirics, on the data of the problems related to monetary sanctions, the racial disparate outcomes, the control of poor people. Now we know. And now we're all complicit in this unless we do something. And so I think that's what it is. We've got to continue the education and have these conversations to bring people along. But at a certain point, y'all can't hide from this anymore. You have to do something to make a difference.
Right. There's a lot to be done. And then, Professor, as you touched on something that, I want to chime in on, and Ms. Davis, if you can add any comment, it'd be great, about being complicit. Now, there's a lot of forms of complicity, but what I've seen is, even recently in my own experience, there are things where you see an injustice happening or a wrong, but everyone in the room waits for you as the person to to be the spokesperson essentially, right? And it's like, well, I was thinking that the whole time, and I was wondering why you didn't speak up or say something. And I think that's part of the problem. It's not that people don't know there are issues out there. I think a lot of people do, but who's going to stand up and do something? Tonie, you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, there's something, being complicit can be intentional or even unintentional, right? But I think that one of the most serious forms of being complicit is when you just refuse to do anything, right? When you're able to walk in your door, when you arrive at home, close it and not have to turn on your television or see the images that other people can't escape on a day-to-day basis, or the realities that people face on a day-to-day basis, because that's not your life, that's not your experience. The only way, honestly, to confront being complicit is to intentionally work to not be complicit, to put forth that not just educating yourself, but having really tough conversations, being willing to stand up, to be courageous in those moments when you feel like you'd rather buckle or that your voice will fail you if you say anything. Oftentimes we look to those that are victims to be the ones to speak up, those that are more impacted, right? To take to the streets or to speak to the powers that be and to demand change. In this instance, being complicit is not joining in any of those efforts and more. There's not a one size fits all for the different things that one can do, but what it comes down to, again, is just being intentional, being deliberate about what your engagement looks like and how you're engaging. Yeah, that's what comes to mind.
Right. Thank you. And I think one of the overarching themes of the movie that, you know, came to me is what you're really seeing is an effort to change systems from many different angles when you really break it down. And I'm curious about your thoughts of, you know, what are political forces that you see shaping kind of the system for what's fair, just, and legal? And where do those forces apply, or to whom are they applied?
James, you're gonna have to call on one of us, but you know, I think well, you know, we're in an amazing moment right now where we're seeing calls to dismantle our criminal legal system, and I think it, you know, we're interesting. I mean, just this week there was a Seattle Times article about the Seattle City Council. I think it has a draft ordinance to really shift attention away from misdemeanors that aren't domestic violence or DUI related, particularly if a person can provide a defense in having engaged in the violation of the law related to their poverty status or a mental health problem. And I think it's an interesting approach to sort of one of the first steps, serious steps to downsize our criminal legal system and remove folks so they don't have to post bail, they don't have to spend a night in jail, they don't have to get that arrest record on their on the, well, there's a sociological term, digital punishment, right? So it's not going to go on the internet, so future employers see that. They don't have that conviction in their file, they don't have the fines and fees. I think it's a first serious step, but I think a big problem is that when we dismantle that, we have to build up existing resources. We have to have housing. We have to have drug treatment, mental health treatment, access for medication and regular therapy. We have to replace this very destructive, violent, trauma-inducing system with supportive care. And I think that at least from what I understand right now, is a huge piece that's missing. And I don't know why that's not in the, maybe it is in the conversation, I just haven't heard it. Ms. Davis, you might know more about it, so I'll let you speak.
Well, I think that it has been a part of the discussion, especially when we talk about those, when the protest began, there was a lot of conversation about defunding the police department, right? And people immediately panicked because they thought that we would be without police officer. And for most people, that translates into, I will no longer be safe, or my community will no longer be safe. But in fact, the message isn't to absolutely take away all of those police services, right? It's about being intentional again about how we spend our tax dollars, who we're supporting with those tax dollars. One of the biggest things that always seems to get cut first, and it baffles me, are social services. When we're looking at where in the budget can we scale back, it's the services that support those that need the most support, those that are most vulnerable. And investing in those social services, as Alexis has already pointed out, mental health, drug treatment, housing, which is, it's critical. I mean, we are in a housing crisis, and most people don't realize, but even here in the state of Washington, that disproportionately Black people are unhoused more than any other race. So it's really looking at ways that we can, it's reimagining how we're doing what we're doing. I think that power and control has created systems that have performed and showed up the same ways over and over. It's low-hanging fruit, right? To over-police in communities of color, because as the gentleman said, it's true today, what they said to him then, no one's gonna believe you. You know, more times than not, you're gonna have a white judge, a white prosecutor, a white man is going to say that you did this to him, and so on and so forth. And until we start really focusing on the systems that support and keep people out of those systems, out of the criminal justice system, and we stop over-policing communities and focusing on people of color, and we stop imposing LFOs that keep people bound to debt forever, and oftentimes without the means to drive, for example, if you have a ticket. But to reimagine the systems that tend to plague and keep certain people oppressed.
Yeah, it's interesting. I touched on it before. One of the biggest things I see is, the power play. And for me, it really stems back to property and, originally Black people being used as property, and kind of how property is used to create wealth in society, and just how many different things it controls. These are my own thoughts, so I just want to put that out there, that I really think that, a lot of majority of law was really just created to protect property, depending on how you want to slice it. I think you can root it back to that almost no matter what. But I'll stand to be challenged on that. In terms of creating a new system or reforming or defuncting, and I'm going to you, Professor Harris, and calling names. Are there any other tools that you haven't necessarily outlined yet, or you think that could help reverse racism, which is really a big question, a big ask? I don't think it's something that's going to be done overnight, so I don't want that to be assumed in the question. But in terms of maybe beginner steps, what do you see?
Right. I mean, it's a good point. It's taken us 400 years to get where we're at today, right? So we're not going to change this overnight. And I think you're right. I mean, I think there's a couple different levels. I think Ms. Davis was talking about where sort of people can step in. I see some questions about what can white allies do. One of the conversations that I like to put on the table, usually when I'm talking to predominantly white groups, is a concept, the difference between ally versus accomplice. And actually, I had a graduate student teach this to me. But allies really are, you can get badges for being an ally, right? You can go to your training, you can do it online. And many people who consider themselves allies see themselves as progressives and sort of know the language. But for me, accomplices are people who are willing to share their status and even maybe take some hits or damage to their status. So for example, in a faculty meeting, when a colleague will yell at me, a white man, right, be extremely disrespectful, an ally will email me afterwards and tell me, wow, that was bad. You know, he shouldn't have spoken to you like that. Can you believe that? But an accomplice in the moment will disrupt that exchange and say, hey, bud, that's inappropriate. You should not be talking to her like that. So accomplices will sort of get in it and get dirty, even when they're sweating and your heart's pounding. They will disrupt it because they know that people of color constantly have to bear that burden and be that person to call it out. So accomplices, particularly white accomplices in hard moments, will help disrupt those hard moments. And it might, you know, people might look at them differently moving forward. I think accomplices also know the difference between intent versus effect. You can't hide behind, my intention was to be supportive, or my intention was to give you a compliment, versus paying attention to the effect. So if I say, hey, whoa, that's offensive, you don't say, well, I didn't mean to be offensive. You hear what I'm saying as an accomplice and say, I apologize and I need to learn why, and go do that reading on your own. Don't expect for people of color to explain that to you. So I think there's some different sort of points of positionality that people can take to really help in the individual level. I think another, read. A lot of people this summer have been reading White Fragility. I recently read White Rage by Carol Anderson. She's a professor at Emory, and I think it's more of a helpful framework to understand what's happening today. White fragility is a general sense that white people in our society have been sort of coddled, and the culture is to sort of protect them in these hard conversations. And so when we talk about race, or when we say that's offensive, many times people might cry or hide behind their intentions versus really coming to terms with the effect, as Mr. Stevenson was saying, is really facing that trauma that breaks all of us. But Professor Anderson talks about white rage and how we can think about all of these points of legal protections given to suppress Black people and other people in this country. The voter suppression we see today, right, is white rage ingrained in our institutions and our laws. So just having that whole different framework from saying, no, it's not really about being a victim. It's not really about being sensitive. It's about recognizing that rage, which you see our rage in the streets, your rage is embedded in the laws, right? Your rage is incarcerating us. So I think different moments on the individual level. I think also really reading and having a framework for really understanding the trauma and violence that's being done on a daily basis to communities of color. And then figuring out, where do you have discretion? Where do you have power? Where can you put your vote? Are ways in which our white allies and people can make a change moving forward.
And I kind of want to touch on something that you mentioned in the scenario of, you know, kind of having that event happen. And, you know, I want to speak on it, and then Ms. Davis, if you have any comment on it. I'm wondering if you were even surprised that it happened. And what I mean by that is, you have these moments where someone kind of says something off the cuff or inappropriate, and then you have to go through a certain processes of re-education. There's mass emails and all that. In my experience, it's almost happened so many times that it's not that it's a non-factor now. It's like, this is nothing new. And I see a lot of people making big issues out of it and saying we're going to do all these things, but then nothing really happens. And for me, you know, a tool is only as good as the person who wields it. So does it really even matter if you're just going to kind of, what I'm going to characterize as fake the funk and say, hey, I'm going to do all these things and be great. And then next month or next week, something else is happening. Maybe it's not you, but you're in the same space, but you don't say anything. And maybe that's just a thought out there, but, Ms. Davis, if you have any response to that, feel free to go ahead. Otherwise, we can keep the party going.
I would just add that, again, it kind of gets back to the whole truth, that thread of truth that we were talking about before, to resist the instinct to personalize and think that coming to some form of reconciliation is a way of finding guilt or innocence. It's a way, it's merely recognizing the harm and the impact that that various systems have had on people of color in particular. I think if someone could create a tool that would encourage those discussions in brave ways, but to focus on the harm as opposed to the guilt and assignment of guilt, because we really don't care. There's nothing that we can do about the hundreds of years that have occurred. I mean, there are remedies, mind you, like reparations. But what I'm talking about is, how do you move forward? How do we get past this place in this space? Because frankly, it's cyclical. And I think that's what you were getting at, James. It's like, we have these conversations, oh, great, we're gonna make headway. And then it kind of just goes back into that same pattern. How do we break that cyclical pattern to actually move forward, as opposed to doing the same thing over and over, and the only thing that's evolving is our banter and the rhetoric around it, right? It really is about having brave conversations, being willing to be uncomfortable, but also having the courage to recognize the harm that these systems cause, not only to adults, but to children who are watching the system play out, to children who are incarcerated as a way of being, as opposed to because something warranted it. We have a way of, I'll end there, but and the only way that we could really move forward is for us to recognize that there really is harm and that there has been impact, and to want to do something different so that it doesn't keep occurring, just in a different way.
Right. And I think that touches on your earlier point about kind of the job not stopping once you get home and close your door. There's a constant education and a duty, if we're really going to change. Like, we can see the incremental steps and changes from 400 years ago to today. And we all know and acknowledge, and I think that's part of the reason why we're here, is that the job's not done, right? And so in terms of when people ask, is there something I can do as an ally or maybe now an accomplice? Yeah, there's a lot you can do. And the easiest thing you can do is to remain active and help push the ball forward, right? Because it takes all of us. It takes a village to raise a child, and we're all in this together, whether we want to believe it or not. We've been diametrically opposed or whatever, and split down by race. But I think right now the current culture of what we have, ever since George Floyd and everything that's gone on, right? The timing's right to really make a big push, right, and not allow the common structures that say, hey, I'm in power, I just get to walk away from it, right? And I think that's one of the things that really touched me in watching the film. And one thing that was brought up was kind of the attitude that if you're in power, you don't need to apologize. And the question I pose, well, then why don't we hold that person accountable, or those peoples, or that institution? So what I want to pose to you, Professor Harris, is what's the role of hope in creating a future of racial equality in our nation?
I think that hope, we have to hold on to it because it's going to fuel our movement. We need something. I think, my 13-year-old daughter who's over on the couch listening, I got to give her hope, and she's my hope, that the world will be better. And the world is better, like you said, incrementally. It's much different than it was for my father, who was African-American and Filipino and born in 1930, right? So hope keeps us moving forward. So we need hope, but we also need real structural change. We can only fly so far on passion and commitment and all that. So I think in this moment, it's been great that so many, from the NFL to universities to Ben and Jerry's, right, having these symbolic statements about Black Lives Matter and fight systemic racism. Well, I don't think the NFL has gone that far, but we need real measurable standards, right? We need to see, okay, say what you're going to do within your organization, within your institution, within the new laws and policies, but how can we measure them in 6 months and a year? That's where I think we need to focus. And so I'm trying to tie it back into hope, and I don't know how, but I think the hope is in the numbers, right? If we can have some data and I can measure some type of change in whatever you say you're going to do, then that will bring me hope to keep me pushing further.
Sounds what you're saying is that we need a check-in or a status report. You're a professor, so you give out grades and everyone gets a report card, right?
Right.
I'd like to add that, and I agree, right? Hope is that thing that you reach for when you're at your lowest, oftentimes. Like, hope is that last thing that survives.
Okay.
And for that reason, it kind of has this passive, there's this passivity to it in this context, because the same way that the structures were intentionally created to oppress, we have to be intentional and very deliberate in what we do to undo them. Whether it's the way that we vote, the conversations that we have, confronting our own biases, and the list goes on. But I think that hope does have a role. It does play a role during those times when you may feel like I can't go on. So I need something else or someone else to rely upon. But I would like to challenge us to do more than just hope, and to actually be deliberate about undoing the threads of institutional racism.
That's great. Yeah, I look at hope as kind of the fuel of reform, and think, like with any system, it gets better with time. You create a machine, it's not perfect your first go around, right? But you can keep working on it. And the hope for me is that, things were worse. What's not in my bio is that I'm originally from Charleston, South Carolina, and I can remember going into the country and going into a building where it's painted over now, but you can still see whites only at a water fountain. 6 years old the first time I saw that, right? And what does that mean to me, and why did that happen? Having to ask that question. And then on the ride home, you roll by cotton fields, and I can hear my grandpa's voice in my head right now, telling me how he had to pick cotton and get a quarter for, work that's backbreaking work that I would never want to do, right? And to know that, he went through certain things that now got me to this point, and predecessors before that. I have hope for my children, right, who sit down there and I think are listening somewhere, but that it'll be a better world for them. And I'm hopeful that, just even having this conversation, right, 40, 50, 60 years ago, would we have had this? No, we wouldn't. But I think people are really trying to make a change. And I think, what we've been saying is that really consistency is key. The proof is in the pudding, right? I'm not coming back with a report card, but next year this time, how much growth will we have seen? I think that's really what we're all looking for. I don't think it's going to be solved in a year, no, but we can be in a better place. And with that, what I really want to do is just kind of open up the conversation for the participants. You can drop a question in the Q&A and we can go from there.
And while they do that, James, can I share a few resources
Sure.
with folks? I actually went through my book collection and pulled out some suggested readings, one of which is Just Mercy. I don't think that this is going to work with my background very well, but by Bryan Stevenson. And then there is this beauty called A Pound of Flesh by our esteemed panelist that focuses on the criminalization of punishment for being poor. Push Out, which is a book by Monique Morris that discusses the criminalization of Black girls in schools. Again, we're talking about systems. There's The Color of Law, which discusses segregation and neighborhood segregation. And then one of my favorites is Stamped from the Beginning. It's a beast of a read, if you could see how thick this book is, by Ibram Kendi. But it really touches upon the racism in our country and the premise of it and how it shows up in systems. And there's many others. And I would invite you, if you're interested, to go to the ACLU of Washington website, where there is a list of books, suggested books to read, all of which the books that I've just shared with you are on that list, but there's many, many more for people who are interested in immersing themselves in the work. And finally, one of my favorite books, How to Read the Constitution and Why. If there is no other time, this would be a good time.
Yes.
To visit this book. The Constitution Matters. We know that it's an imperfect document to the extent that it wasn't intended to include people of color who were not property owners and who weren't even considered a full person. But that's the tool that we have, and it works, and we'll continue using it at the ACLU to fight on behalf of people. So by all means, visit the website and get you some books.
Can I share a couple of mine? I just, since we're pulling out books, I had to go to my bookshelf. Fatal Invention by Dorothy Roberts is a great book too, to think about sort of the social construction of race, but how it's been used in medicine and produce health disparities. I mentioned White Rage by Carol Anderson, which is a powerful framing. Sort of a companion is her other book, One Person, No Vote, which is particularly relevant, but really highlights voter suppression. And then this book, The Condemnation of Blackness by Khalil Gibran Muhammad, is a powerful history of the evolution of from slave capturers to contemporary police forces. So it's a really good read too. And then I'll put in, if you go to my website, I'll put it in here. I have a suggested reading as well, and a lot of lists that were compiled by other people, and I cite who they were compiled by, but I think they're helpful. So I'll put that in the chat.
Another thing that accomplices and allies can do, and I love that, by the way, that accomplices provide a different role than allies. But another thing that people can do is to go through training. There are various outlets around the state of Washington and throughout the country, including the People's Institute, that provide race equity training. And I have gone through various trainings myself, and I continue to, because we're all a part of, we were all born and raised in this system. And And so constantly undoing what we have come to know as our beliefs and challenging the norms. But I would also suggest that you keep going through training, keep challenging yourselves in that way.
Okay. Two of the questions that I can see in the chat have deal with what I'm going to call perception. I'm not saying that that's what your question poses. I'm just saying that's how I interpret it. One of the questions was about, and I'm just going to summarize, a question of where adults were, established adults, specifically lawyers, doctors, professors, business owners, and other professionals being intentionally present at the various marches and rallies, and kind of poses the question of why were they not there to give hope and guidance and take risks besides the youth? And what I would say is that, in terms of perception, how do you know who was out there marching beside you? For example, if you saw me walking down the street, do you know that I'm James Johnson? No. You don't know I'm a lawyer. You don't know that I've been a prosecutor or that I'm president of the Loren Miller Bar Association, right? And I don't think that matters. But that's also an issue that we've dealt with historically that's been a problem, is perception, and the wrong perception of what that means to be just an individual, right? And that's notwithstanding really any boundary. And what I will say is that I've been to, just on that specific point, I've been to several different marches and rallies that were specifically for those groups, as well as the ones where, there were youth involved. So I can't speak for everyone, just like we typically can't. But I'm hopeful that you understand that there were people out there, allies and accomplices, that are what have been dubbed as established adults marching alongside the youth as well. So I'll leave that there. Another question, and I'm going to go to you, Professor Harris, is kind of talking about the word accomplice and the association of that being with a criminal element. And do you think there could be a different term used, or is accomplice sufficient?
I'm sure we could come up with another word. I hope people would take the, I can say this now, the intent behind the word. Sorry, a little play on words there. So yeah, definitely we could come up with a different word for it, but partner, maybe, I don't know. It sounds similar to ally. I'm not going to get hung up on semantics about this, but I hope people understand the point. And the point is for someone to be willing to engage in the moment and to give up their status and their power, or share their status and power in that moment. And you can use whatever word makes you feel comfortable. Yeah, but I hear you. Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's always interesting to me, because words do matter, right? I do believe that words matter, but I also believe that words can also be blinking terms and carry with them varying definitions depending on who the individual is. But at the end of the day, what really matters is the intent and the description of the role that Professor Harris described as being someone who is active and not passively sitting by. So I agree. I don't think that the word itself matters as much as the conduct.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I'll ask for any more questions out there. I know that we're gonna have to conclude this matter at 8 o'clock. So if there are any other questions out there, we'd be.
Well, James, I can say one thing while we're waiting for other questions is I, had the opportunity in January actually to go to the memorial and the museum in Montgomery. And it's powerful. So if any of you, this is one way where you can sort of lend your powers. Well, once we start traveling again in a safe way, have your conferences in Montgomery. There's plenty of hotels down there, and then spend a day. And that's what I did. I was there for a conference with SBLC and they're based down there. So it made sense. But have your conferences in places like that to support the museum and the memorial and to really feel that history. I teach this stuff, and one of my mentors, Stu Tonie, wrote a book, Festival of Violence, and documented the lynching. So you'd think that I would know this, but I went in a very naive way to the memorial where there was those big, I don't know, it was iron, I don't know what they were, with the county name and the names. And for some reason I went in and I thought, I'm going to read every name to honor them. And I did not realize, you feel the numbers and numbers of people who were lynched when you walk in there. There's no way I could have read every name. It was too many. So I think we need museums, we need memorials like this to feel that pain and that trauma, to remind us, to give us that hope that we've made changes, but to also fuel our passion to continue to do the work. So I just wanted to give a plug to, if you can, go and visit Montgomery and participate actively in feeling that history.
Thank you.
Did I buy you enough time?
Going through. I don't see any specific questions. I'm seeing more comments. Let me check the other mediums. I don't know if anyone knows, is there a virtual tour of the museum? It's the only question I see. That I don't know.
I don't know.
Seen a question about, do you believe we're able to force restorative policies? For example, the 1994 crime bill promised rehabilitation programs along with punitive mandates. Fast forward to today, and politicians say we got it wrong. However, we don't see the legislation to reverse or repair the generational effects. Is there a way to force reparative legislation? Yeah, vote.
I mean, yes, that's it.
Vote, run for office. I think that's another huge thing that it really kind of goes under the radar. I mean, even wherever you live, you know, pull out your voter's pamphlet and look at how many unopposed seats there were. And how long has that person been there, right? So I think one of the bigger things, if you really want societal change, you need people from the society, like they're at this event, that have different thoughts, into these positions of power to help really force the issue and change. But a lot of times we are deterred, scared, whatever it is, or avoid these elected positions that could really help force the change. And I think that's really the biggest way, is to get people with new, fresh ideas into office.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if this is appropriate, but I'm going to go ahead and say is that we have an opportunity in, I don't know what district it is, but to elect one of the first people, might be the first persons ever to be formally incarcerated to the Washington State House of Representatives. So I would encourage you to look down your ballot if you haven't already turned it in. I know many of us have already turned it in. We have the opportunity to vote for 2 Washington State Supreme Court justices who have been recently appointed. One is one of the first Native American persons to serve. Another is a Black woman. So I would say, look, and representation matters. Experience matters. It's not tokenism. It's really thinking through how people's lived experience matter in interpreting and applying the law.
And I would say that there's not there's not a one size fits all, right? There's going to be those that will take to the street. There's going to be those that will run for office, or that will support people who are running for office, whether it's fiscally or otherwise. There's people who do this type of work as a living, right? Throughout the country, the ACLU is challenging all of these laws that are unconstitutional and have a disparate impact on people of color. We at the ACLU of Washington critically look at our cases through a race equity lens. And where race plays a factor, we call it out. We want the court to know. We think it's important that the court knows. The Supreme Court, as a matter of fact, just had a CLE of sorts, or continuing legal education, but it was open to everyone. And by the Supreme Court, I'm talking about the Washington State Supreme Court, where they addressed race and the impacts of race bias within the state courts. So these are conversations that are happening in new ways and in different ways. But again, we can't stop with just the banter and the rhetoric. We have to do something with all of this energy. So even if you're not taking to the street in order to try to affect change legislatively, if you have a phone, call your representatives, both local, state, federal. There's different ways that you can make noise. As a matter of fact, how about becoming familiar with those community-led organizations, those BIPOC-led organizations in your community, or even outside of your community? Listen to them, and then, as opposed to, listen to them, and listen with a heart of doing something that they want done, as opposed to what you think would be best. But getting back to the initial question of, how do you remedy that 1994 crime bill? You do it through litigation. Litigation is slow and it's hard, and it takes up a lot of resources. So you support those organizations that are doing that heavy lifting, as well as supporting the organizations that are lobbying and trying to make change through their legislature.
Right. And ever since my comment about questions, there are tons, and I apologize, everyone. I will not be able to get to every single question the next 3 minutes, but what I will ask of the panel, and I'll go back to you, Ms. Davis, just to start us off, is what was your favorite part about the movie?
Wow. I personally, I love Bryan Stevenson. He is a hero of mine. I think that the most, I can't say it was my favorite part, right? But it was a part that had the biggest impact on me, was seeing the result of his work when it's successful. When there's not another Black man who has been executed by a system that always intended to cut his life short. That was my favorite part.
Thank you. Professor Harris?
I'm getting, this has been a long week, and we're all coming up to Tuesday, so there's a lot of emotions. So I can't say there was a favorite part in any way. I think what I appreciate most, my dissertation was on juvenile court, South Central LA, and juvenile transfer. So I think what I appreciate, I know that I avoid feeling the pain and the sadness associated with the work that we do. So I'll say that I appreciated having to sit here for an hour and watch it and feel some of that pain again. It sounds sick, but in a way it gave me hope, or it fueled my passion and reminded me of why I engage in this work and I teach. So again, it's not my favorite part, but feeling connected to the work, feeling that pain. We all need to be reminded of that. I think we need that gut punch every now and then to just kick us in our butts and say, keep on going, I think it's fair to say that many of us are extremely privileged, and that there I go, but for the grace of God, and that we need to continue to do this work, continue to feel this pain every now and then, so we don't get complicit. right? And so that we continue to engage, continue to teach, continue to learn, continue to engage. So again, it's not anyway my favorite, but it's something I needed.
Yeah. For me, and I'll call it a favorite, I think it touches on what both of you just spoke to. But for me, it was perspective and the reality of the situation, and kind of walking you back through kind of how we got here, right? And the educational piece of it. There's stuff in there I don't know. I don't actively go out and study and research everything that was addressed in the movie, right? You know, some, I'll say by osmosis or whatever experience that you've had. But to really just go back and have something that powerful be shown to you on screen, and like you said, have a gut punch and really have to deal with it. And when I say that I appreciate the perspective, it's because it provoked thought in me. I even took notes on the movie like I was back in school again, that I'll go back to, which is good to know, because I think sometimes you not lose sight, but you forget some of the things that really motivate you. And you need those constant reminders to, you know, kind of keep you going. And that movie did that for me. And I think any and everyone that watched it will have a different response to the movie, a different feeling, and that's fair. That's great. My hope is that, you know, as we created this space, as we have this space, that we're able to do something positive with it. And I want to thank everybody that was a participant today. Thank you for everyone that's here to listen to these voices and all the production. I think it was a great event, and I'm appreciative of everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to engage. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
We thank you, Ms. Davis and ACLU of Washington. We thank you, Dr. Harris and the University of Washington. And we thank you, Mr. Johnson and the Loren Miller Bar Association. Thank you all for speaking like Bryan Stevenson with truth. We are so grateful that at this moment, we are better because what you all spoke, what you all share, what you all gave tonight. So we thank the three of you and your organizations. And we are so grateful to the Meaningful Movies Project, and Miller, Judith Yarrow, and your team. Thank you so much. We thank Patrice Bell and the NAAM staff for being so involved in this evening. Thank you. And to all of you who are here with us tonight, we thank you. The organizations who collaborated to present tonight's film and discussion welcome your support, your donations, and your interest in volunteering. Each of these organizations have some amazing programs coming up. So visit our websites, follow us on social media, and encourage others to do the same. Tonight's recording will be placed on NAAM's YouTube channel, and you all will get a follow-up email with several components of information that was shared in the chat tonight. And we're going to close tonight with the words that Bryan Stevenson spoke in the film. He said, quote, "Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done." Thank you all, and we'll see you at an upcoming program again soon. Thank you and good night.
Good night.